All right, welcome. I want to talk about skeletal system, and there's a lot to discuss, so I'm going to break it down into parts. We're going to talk today just about the basic functions of bone. And we're all aware that we have bones, that the bones are movable. And so when we talk about functions of bones, we might first think about how they're associated with muscles, and they provide attachment sites for muscles. And whenever we're making movements, we're basically moving our skeletal system using the muscles and stretching across joints, and we'll get more into the movement and the whole function of muscles when we talk about muscles. But right now we're talking about skeletal system itself, and the functions go beyond just moving. So protection is another one that comes to mind. Our skull, the brain in there. We have protection for our heart and lungs and so forth. We have some unprotected areas, right? The gut down there is just a big open space, but if you had it totally encased in bone, then it would make it difficult to deal with those big meals and letting, for easy passage of food and whatever. So where to begin? The skeletal system can be divided into axial and appendicular systems, and that is simply going to be the axial skeleton. As you can see here, consists of the skull, all the bones of the skull, the hyoid bone included, which kind of comes down there, attaching to the larynx, all the vertebrae, and the ribs. What does the axial skeleton not include? And they're throwing in this piece here, which is called linea alba. That's not bone. That's a fibrous connective tissue. It's kind of like a tendon, or rather a ligament, because it's going muscle or bone to bone, so it would be more of a ligament. And you can see that there are ligaments at the joints as well, right? Helping stabilize the joints and form joint capsules and so forth. So anyhow, the axial skeleton, as we were saying, it consists of then things that are on the central axis. And it may help to think about, what does a snake have? A snake only has an axial skeleton, essentially. It has a skull, vertebrae, lots of ribs. It does not have a pelvic girdle or a pectoral girdle or any appendages. So the appendicular skeleton, in contrast, consists of the pelvic girdle, which is the clavicle and scapula together, and the pelvic girdle, which consists of the three bones that are fused together on each side to form this hip joint, or the hip, rather, the ilium and the ischium and the pubic bone fused together. And then the appendages, the things that attach, all the bones of the arms and legs. So that's how we divide axial and appendicular. In terms of functions of the skeleton, we talked about support and movement. Protection is another one. We have flat bones that protect a lot of our internal organs. Production of red blood cells, or hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis. This is primarily in these bones in adults. So sternum, ribs, pelvis, scapula, clavicle, but also in the head of the humerus and the head of the femur. And they're really, I guess we'd have to remove the capsule to see, but it's not just the head. I mean, the proximal portion of the diaphysis, I think, still has some hemopoiesis going on. But in children, it's kind of all over. They're doing a lot more blood cell production. Those are just some of the functions. Another function is mineral storage. So 90+ % of your calcium is stored in your bones. 99% of your Phosphorus is in your bones, your magnesium storage. So those are all very important, and we'll talk about the functions of those minerals a little bit. The bone types, this is a little bit silly, I think. I mean, to say, oh, we have long, short, flat, irregular, sesamoid. Long bones don't have to be particularly long. This is a long bone. Beep. And it's not very long. So why is it a long bone? Just because its shape is longer than it is wide. And short bones are like in the wrist or in the ankle are considered short bones. Flat bones, pretty much the bones of the cranium, the sternum, the scapula, you know, kind of broad, flat covering. One thing about the flat bones too is the arrangement. You've got two layers of compact bone with spongy bone in between, and so this is called a diplo arrangement. And then we have irregular bones, like the vertebra. All the vertebrae are weird shapes, so hey, let's just call them irregular. So not particularly exciting classifications, I don't think. But and then the sesamoid bone, we'll talk about bone formation. And sesamoid bones, you don't have many, but they're forming, in this case, kind of within a tendon. So flat bones, long bones, short bones. I mean, do we have more information here? It's pretty, your short bones are pretty much in your wrist, the carpals, and in your foot, the tarsals. And these have individual names. These bones, there's the talus, there's the calcaneus, this one's the cuboid bone, and here's the navicular, and then we have three cuneiform bones, a medial, a lateral, and an intermediate. And these are referring to the cuneiform tablets, which were the early, like some of the earliest writing, these little clay tablets. Somebody thought they looked like those. The navicular, somebody thought, hey, it looks like a boat. The cuboid, somebody thought, hey, look, it's cuboidal. It's shaped like a cube. And I actually don't know what calcaneus means, but it's the largest bone. You know, it's your heel. It's your heel bone. It's the largest bone of your tarsals. And then the talus, I haven't given too much thought about what that word means either, but it's, you can see it's articulating with the fibula and the tibia. So it's the, you know, top of the ankle there. The carpals also have individual names, and sometimes classes learn them, you know, introductory classes, and sometimes they don't. They have some interesting names like the trapezium and the trapezoid and the capitate and the hamate, and then the scaphoid, lunate, and triquetral or triquetrum, which is a triangular one. And let me see, can we change the position? Let's look at them from here. We also have one more, the pisiform bone. And there are, let's see, if you, I'm not sure how to twist this at quite the right angle so you can see, but starting on this proximal medial side, see that there's the thumb, and so here's the distal end of the radius. So starting with the scaphoid, the most common mnemonic that I've heard is some lovers try, for triquetral, some lovers try positions, and then going back to the medial side, that they cannot handle. Some lovers try positions that they cannot handle to help you remember at least the first letters for scaphoid, lunate, triquetral, pisiform, and then the trapezium, trapezoid. And yes, those are a little tough to, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, cannot, hamate, handle. So, and they do have some weird shapes, and you can individually get to know them. But like I say, for beginning stuff, sometimes you include the names, sometimes you just say, hey, look, carpal bones. And that phrase, carpe diem, seize the day, it's kind of really, wrist the day, if you think about it. And you're just, these short bones are transferring forces. Sesamoid bones are reinforcing tendons. So basically, the patella is our example of a sesamoid bone, and you're born without a patella, but you have this tendon going from your quadriceps muscles to this position on the tibia, and so it's called the patellar ligament here because it's going bone to bone, but really it's all part of a big quadriceps tendon if we added the muscles here. And so, just you're born without it, but you have this big tendon, and the patella forms within the tendon and reinforces that. So if you know a young mother who's nervous about everything and, freaking out about just everything with her baby, then go appreciate that little newborn and say, oh, wow, just perfect. Wait a minute, does your baby have kneecaps? I can't feel any kneecaps. Oh, new mothers love that kind of joking around. Okay, I'm kidding. Let's look at parts of a long bone. Okay, so some words here. This is the femur as an example, and we have diaphysis, which is the long part, and the epiphyses. There's a proximal epiphysis and a distal epiphysis, and so basically the shaft and the two ends, right? And within the shaft we have a medullary cavity, basically an opening here, kind of hollow down the shaft. And at the epiphyses we have an area of spongy bone, and spongy bone's always surrounded by compact bone, and the whole, I can't twist this around, the diaphysis has a collar, a ring of compact bone. The other thing, I don't think I can zoom in any closer on this either. There's a lot of vascularization to bones, good blood supply, but also keep in mind that blood is being made. Here's the femur, so even in an adult, blood is being made in the proximal epiphysis, and there are holes for blood vessels to go out and in, and even the hard calcified bony parts of bone have living cells that need blood supply. And if you hit yourself on bones, especially like your shin bone or here, that there are nerve cells. Those nerve cells are in a fibrous coating on the outside of the bone called the periosteum, and there's also a coating inside the medullary cavity. It's not really a coating like the outside. The outside is definitely this like a sheet of tough saran wrap kind of laid over the top of the bone. The inside is just the margin, kind of the endosteum is just the margin between bone and the medullary cavity. In the endosteum is where you'll find a lot of osteoclasts, which are going to be involved in breaking down bone tissue. And in the periosteum, you'll see more osteoblasts, which are involved in building up the bone tissue. Now you can have different, you could have those, there are going to be some osteoblasts on the periosteum and some osteoclasts. I said that backwards. There are going to be some osteoclasts on the periosteum as well, some osteoblasts on the endosteum as well, but pretty much you build up on the outside and you eat away on the inside. And bones are remodeling all the time, depending on your calcium intake, your exercise levels, all sorts of factors, your hormones, your age. So, the other thing we haven't mentioned, I guess, is the yellow bone marrow. That there's a type of fat that we store in our bone marrow, and apparently it's pretty good for you if you eat it, you know, like from cows. Ossobuco or something like that, I think, is the dish where they just cut up femur sections and bake it for long periods of time. I've never had it. Compact versus spongy bone. So here is, let's see, where should we start? There's the periosteum. Here's a little perforating canal, these little holes where the blood vessels can move in and out. You'll see an arrangement of rings, and I hope this is showing up okay. But there's a central canal, and inside that central canal is blood vessels. And so here's central canal. And then you have little passageways, little tiny canals going out. And these little tiny canals are called Canaliculi, like baby canals. The Canaliculus is singular. And then these little spaces where the cells live, the osteocytes, are called, the space is called a lacuna, which is basically just a little lake. So the osteoblasts, those that are secreting, well, they're new bone tissue, they cause crystallization of the minerals around them. So an osteoblast matures into an osteocyte, because basically it builds all around it until it can't move anymore, and then, hey, I'm stuck for the rest of my life. But luckily I built little passageways while I was doing this, so I can communicate with my neighbors and my buddies, and so I can have access to some blood supply. So yeah, those are the osteocytes are stuck inside their lacunae, and you can see that they are arranged in rings, and that there's a layer of bone of hard mineral between them. The layers are called lamellae. So this is a lamella, this is a lamella, this is a lamella, and it's just different layers with osteocytes in the rings between. So that's the arrangement. And so this whole thing is called an osteon, if you want to call it that. In spongy bone, it looks like a sponge. It's not squishy like a sponge, it's hard. And so the little spongy extensions, these beams that run every direction, are called trabeculae, and they're arranged a little bit differently. There's no central canal, because they're exposed, you know, they're in the medullary cavity, and there are blood vessels around on the outside, so they don't need a central canal. But other than that, it's pretty much like the osteons of the compact bone. Not much different. There's another thing about osteons here. I don't think it would tell us much different, but let's look. There's the compact bone, or cortical bone, meaning the cortex, the outside. The osteon is that whole ring of, well, ring of rings, right? Several rings that we just looked at with a central canal, and the rings are the lamellae, and the osteocytes live in the lacunae, and there's some blood vessels inside the central canal. So we looked at a little section of one with a central canal, but those central canals run the whole length, and then little capillaries can branch out. Okay, good enough. Bone cells. Let's look at the bone cells. So we've mentioned some of these. Here's the osteocyte. It's mature bone cell, and this is nice because it shows that it's not just a flat two-dimensional thing, which it kind of looks like when you make your sections for histology. You can see, no, it's three-dimensional, and it's got communications through the canaliculi with other bone cells. It has little gap junctions between, and I don't know what they talk about all day, but they're stuck there, so they might as well chit-chat. The osteoclasts are actually derived from a monocyte precursor. They come from, they're not derived from the osteogenic cells that make up osteoblasts, which become osteocytes. These guys have a different origin, still inside the bone marrow, because remember, bone marrow is making blood cells, red blood cells and white blood cells. So one of these white blood cell precursors, one path that it can take is to become osteoclasts. Osteoclasts, you can't see really well here, but they're multinucleated. They're kind of these giant cells, and they got little fringy extensions of their cell membrane where they can put down enzymes to just digest, basically, the structure of bone. And this sounds like a bad idea. Why do I want to, eat away my bone? But you don't get a balanced diet every single day. It's absolutely essential that you keep the blood levels constant for calcium and magnesium and phosphorus and so forth. And so, as needed throughout the day, the osteoclasts will just destroy a little bone, and the osteoblasts can build it back up later as needed. Or if I start lifting weights, the osteoblasts are going to get busy strengthening my bone. They'll put its appositional growth, appositional, appositional growth. It grows to the, it thickens the outside. It's not lengthening my bones, but it's thickening them. And as needed, like I say, the osteoclasts tend to be more busy on the inside, on the endosteum side. The osteoblasts tend to be more busy on the outside, but you find them in both places. And also, if I damage my bone, if I get some sort of break or crush it in some way, these guys are going to be busy restructuring and repairing. If I'm bedridden, or if I go up into space or something like that, where I'm just not putting tension on my bones, the osteoclasts will just be busy and start wearing away my bones, and my bones will get weak pretty quickly. You lose a lot of muscle mass and bone mass by being bedridden. It's kind of a bad deal. Bears are able to sit around all winter. They're not really true hibernators. They pretty much just sit around all winter, being bored, sleeping a lot, not eating, not drinking, but they give birth, they nurse their babies, and they're not just sleeping through winter. They're just kind of anyhow, they've got something going on hormonally that they don't lose bone mass really hardly at all. They pretty much, their bones and muscles are good to go when springtime comes. So some people are studying that, trying to figure out, hey, can we use this for bedridden patients? Can we use this for astronauts? That sort of thing. So the osteoblasts put down new bone tissue. They'll eventually build around themselves to the point of becoming osteocytes. Bone formation. Let's do the long bone formation.
During embryonic development, cells called chondroblasts begin secreting cartilage that...
Chondroblasts, chondrocytes, these are words related to cartilage rather than to bone. So osteo is bone, chondro is cartilage, chondrichthyes, cartilaginous fish, sharks and rays, chondro. So this is cartilage. Osteichthyes, bony fish. So it starts, there's a cartilaginous model of our skeletal system before it becomes bone. It's hyaline cartilage. So it starts with chondroblasts, which become chondrocytes after they secrete cartilaginous ground substance.
Develops in the shape of the skeleton's long bones. The bluish, transparent avascular tissue formed is called hyaline cartilage. As the cartilage grows, the chondroblasts in the interior calcify and die. Blood vessels penetrate the structure and deliver osteoblasts. These cells lay down bone material.
So the chondrocytes, they just died. Now, here come the osteoblasts putting down bone tissue.
The cartilage ossifies and spongy bone forms, a medullary cavity develops. At the ends of a long bone, ossification from cartilage also occurs.
So we have a primary ossification center that occurs in the middle of the long bone, in that medullary cavity of the diaphysis, and then in the epiphyses we get a secondary ossification center on each side, and then we end up with some cartilage still in between these two ossification centers. And so the chondroblasts are putting down new cartilage, but it's like the bone's intruding, and the cartilage cells keep growing and growing to, you know, increase the amount of cartilage, but at the same time the bone's growing into it. This happens, you know, during the time that you're growing, and basically when the cartilage cells slow down enough, the bone cells move in all the way, fill it up, and you're done growing.
This process, in which hyaline cartilage becomes bone and grows, is called endochondral ossification.
Endochondral ossification within cartilage, endochondral.
Continues through childhood. After puberty, bone tissue replaces the remaining hyaline cartilage, and the shaft reaches its adult length.
Okay. And so how does that differ from flat bones in the skull? Well, we mentioned that there are flat bones in the skull. Let me show you how they form. Sorry to get distracted by something there. Where was the flat bone formation?
The development of the skeleton's flat bones begins as certain mesenchymal cells at specific points.
Mesenchymal cells? I've never heard it pronounced mesenchymal. Maybe that's the right way I say mesenchymal. Mesenchymal cells. Mesenchymal cells. Basically, instead of a cartilage model, we've got a fibrous membrane.
And embryonic fibrous connective tissue develop into osteoblasts. The osteoblasts cluster together, secrete bone matrix, and develop into osteocytes that deposit calcium and other mineral salts that harden the forming bone matrix. The bony regions spread out into thin columns called trabeculae.
So spread out into thin columns called trabeculae. So this is a spongy bone. Remember how I talked about a diplo arrangement? You have compact bone with spongy bone in between. So then ta-da, you have a flat bone.
Form spongy bone tissue. A fibrous covering called the periosteum forms on the surface of the bone, and a layer of compact bone tissue replaces the upper layers of spongy bone. This process, in which flat bones develop from connective tissue, is called intramembranous ossification.
So intramembranous ossification instead of endochondral ossification.
The development of the skeleton's flat bones begins as certain mesenchymal cells at specific points within embryonic fibrous connect.
Mesenchymal cells. So you can say mesenchymal or mesenchymal.
Tissue develop into osteoblasts.
Anyhow. Types of fractures: bone repair, calcium in the skeleton, osteoporosis, healthy and osteoporotic bone. Let's talk about some of these things. Let's talk about calcium in the skeleton first. So bone is your calcium bank and your phosphorus bank. So it's like 99% of your calcium. And there are different types of minerals in your bone. Some of it's just calcium carbonate, which is limestone essentially. But most of it's this mixture of a calcium phosphorus salt that's called hydroxyapatite, I think. And so yes, it's there, in the skeleton, and the parathyroid glands, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 little glands on the back of the thyroid gland. So there's the thyroid, and they're the parathyroids. 1, 2, 3, 4. They secrete parathyroid hormone, which is going to increase the amount of calcium in your bloodstream. Well, how's it going to do that? Tell the osteoclasts to get busy, and so stimulate osteoclasts. They get busy destroying bone. Ta-da! Blood calcium levels have risen. Thyroid hormone will do the opposite, where it will stimulate osteoblasts to put down more bone. And there are 20 different hormones that affect the skeletal system, so this is really simplified. But you know, growth hormones, sex hormones, a lot of things that are going to have an effect on your skeletal system. But why do we need to maintain blood calcium levels so nicely? Well, for one thing, we like to move our muscles, which every time you move your muscles, it's involving calcium. Now that's within the muscle cells, but still the muscles themselves need to have access to calcium ions. Nerves to fire need to have access to calcium ions. So yeah, pretty important. And so yes, circulatory system, because the hormones go through the circulatory system and it gets the message to the bone cells. So let's talk a little bit more about parathyroid hormone. I mentioned that it stimulates the osteoclast activity, but that's not the only thing it's going to do. It's also going to say, hey, let's activate more vitamin D. Let's tell the kidneys, stop letting out so much calcium and phosphorus. Let's, or well, at least calcium. Let's tell the digestive system, try to take in more calcium. So those are effects of parathyroid hormone. Okay, osteoporosis. I have a little video.
In the skeletal system, cells called osteoclasts constantly remove old bone, while osteoblasts generate new bone. When bone tissue is lost faster than generated, bones can weaken and break. Osteoporosis is a condition in which overall tissue loss within bones results in bone pain, tenderness, and weakened and brittle bones.
So this is a particular problem for older women of European descent, Caucasian women. That's the group that has the most trouble with osteoporosis. And as an example of, you see older women that are hunched over, kyphosis, their bones are breaking down, but they become very brittle. And this was brought home to me when doing human dissection lab, and we were going to remove the rib cage of a woman so that we could take off the whole rib cage. So cut the clavicles, and we had like garden shear whoppers that we were going to use to cut the rib cage, cut the ribs on both sides so that we could lift everything off and look at the lungs and heart. But you could just go with your fingers on this lady and just go press, 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 and you could just, the ribs would just break. So it was not very pleasant, but I learned just how brittle those bones could become. So here's another example. Here's, well, healthy bone. Is there anything they want to tell us about healthy bone? Healthy bones have enough mass to support the body, facilitate motion of the joints. They consist of a dense layer of compact bone which surrounds the inner matrix of struts known as spongy bone, or it's also called cancellous bone or cancellous bone. Both the compact bone and the spongy bone contribute to overall bone strength. The spongy bone contributes to strength because the trabeculae align based on the direction of the stress that the bone's under. Both the compact bone and the spongy bone contribute to overall bone strength. Calcium absorbed from the diet contributes to the development of bone mass, most of which is already developed by the time a person reaches young. Young, I guess I should finish the sentence. reaches young adulthood. Osteoporosis, a condition that develops when the body reabsorbs calcium from bones faster than it can be replenished, causing bone mass to decrease. Osteoporotic activity, or bone, is characterized by the thinning of spongy bone matrix and reduction in thickness of compact bone. As the spongy bone, trabeculae, and compact bone layer become thinner and less dense, the bones weaken and become susceptible to fractures. Okay, well, so you can just look. There's healthy bone. There's osteoporotic bone. Healthy bone, it's thicker, this layer of compact bone, and the trabeculae are more dense. And osteoporotic bone, thinner layer of compact bone, and the trabeculae, the spongy bone, is much less dense. So what can you do about this? Well, diet and sometimes hormone treatments. They do estrogen replacement. There are trade-offs with that. Weight-bearing exercises. I don't think there's anything bad that comes of that. So weight-bearing exercises into old age. Okay, and Africans and people of African descent are less susceptible to it. They genetically have denser bones. Bone repair.
A fractured bone bleeds. Bone repair begins as, over a period of hours, blood at the fracture site clots and forms a hematoma. The healing begins as osteoclasts in the area remove dead bone tissue.
They remove dead bone tissue, so just a reminder that bone tissue is alive.
While fibroblasts penetrate the area and build a fibrocartilaginous callus that bridges the broken bone.
So we didn't talk about fibroblasts, but they're involved in this repair, so making kind of a dense connective tissue, a callus.
Many weeks, osteoblasts transform the callus into bone. Continued remodeling and the mechanical stress put on the bone creates and shapes new bone. Over a period of months or years, the bone regains its original strength, shape, and internal structure.
There you go. I don't really have anything to add to that. Types of fractures, they're pretty straightforward. Closed, meaning it didn't break through the skin, also called simple. Open or compound, it did break through the skin. Green stick fracture, young people, where there's a break on one side and just kind of stressed on the other. Comminuted, meaning it's broken into at least a few pieces. Impacted, crunch, smashed into itself. There are other terms as well. There's spiral fracture, for example, or depression fracture, where somebody knocks you in the head with a rock or something. I did want to see something about just the calcification of the growth plates. And it's okay if we don't have any more information there, but well, it would be nice. That's not a very nice picture for showing what I want. I wanted to see an epiphyseal plate, a growth plate, and we're not seeing that here. We don't even see the epiphyseal line. But basically, you can see on x-rays whether a person's still growing, like a hand x-ray. By the way, on the hands, you don't have epiphyseal plates on both sides of the phalanges, just on one side, I think. But you can see a little space where it's cartilage with bone on each side, and eventually that space closes and there's just a little line. All right, what else are we missing? I think that's a pretty good introduction. Let me check some notes for a moment here. Oh, rickets. So the skin's also, how does the integumentary system tie to the skeletal system? Well, we need to get vitamin D, make vitamin D by exposure to sunlight, and So fairer skin is seen as an adaptation for more northerly living. Anyhow, so lack of vitamin D can lead to rickets, and in adults, osteomalacia, which is kind of similar to osteoporosis, a little different, and scurvy. So diet based, if you don't have vitamin C, then you don't make collagen fibers. It affects the skin, the teeth fall out, but it also affects the bones, and so they break more easily. Osteomyelitis would be an infection of the bone, usually bacterial, usually hard to treat. There's a genetic condition called Osteogenesis Imperfecta, or brittle bone disease, and this is where it's a disorder of your collagen synthesis. So brittle bones and deformed teeth. Osteosarcoma would be bone cancer. Chondrosarcoma would be cartilaginous, or a tumor in the cartilage. That's really rare and would be slow growing. Some other things with breaking: Colles fracture and Pott's fracture. Colles fracture is where you break the distal ends of the radius and ulna, like when you fall and you catch yourself on your hands and you break it, and it gets this weird shape. If you look up Colles fracture, C-O-L-L-E-S, you'll get a funny fork shape to the arm. And then Pott's fracture, similar, except it's at the leg where you break the distal end of the tibia fibula, and this is most often in a sporting accident. Skiing, before they had breakaway bindings, it used to be that you get ski boot fractures really easily. You can also, there are other words in this book, in Notes on Anatomy and Physiology, gives some descriptions of other things with breakages. Note about phosphorus. I mentioned the role of calcium a little bit, but remember, phosphorus, every ATP molecule is triphosphate, so obviously you need phosphorus for that. DNA has sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate backbone, so obviously you need phosphorus for that. Same thing for RNA. Excuse me. The phospholipid bilayer, for your cell membranes, again, phosphates. So definitely needed. And yeah, so calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, all very important. All right, I think we're done for our discussion of bone tissue, and next we will get into the actual names of the bones and the bone